I'd like to thank everybody for joining us. It's a bit strange because we can't see you, we can see each other and nobody else. So we're going to introduce ourselves and talk very briefly about the format of the talk. So I'm Sean Kaye, and I'm the Foundation Programme Leader at the British High School of Art and Design.
I'm Harry Meadley, an artist and lecturer at Leeds Metropolitan University.
And I'm Levin. I'm the director of the Moscow School of Contemporary Art.
Okay, so we're going to talk about blip, 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 and we've split the talk into three sections. So in a moment, I'm going to share my screen with you, and I'm going to talk about the initial history of blip, blip, blip and where it comes from. And then Harry will share his screen and talk to you for the next period of the talk about blip, blip, blip when it was at East Street Arts in Leeds. And then the final section, Misha will talk about the exchanges that we've been doing with Moscow and Manchester students and blip, blip, blip coming to Moscow. It might look a little bit like a sort of collaged aesthetic lecture because I've built my section of it in PowerPoint. Harry's built his section in Keynote, and Misha's built his section in Google Slides. So it might sort of jump between us. So bear with us as we go through that. And at the end, there will be an opportunity to type questions in the Q&A button, and we'll respond to those at the end. Okay, so this talk addresses how Foundation Fine Arts students who studied at Leeds College of Art were able until 2017 to supplement their official course curriculum by becoming active in the exhibitions programme at Blip Blip Blip. Blip 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 is a curatorial programme committed to examining and fostering relationships between contemporary art practice and art education. Whilst the programme's origins are within the foundation building of Leeds College of Art, it soon became an independent programme based at Patrick Studios in Leeds. Blip 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 will shortly be re-established in Moscow to work with Russian and UK artists and art students, particularly with students from the British High School of Art and Design and the Moscow School of Contemporary Art. Through a series of key examples, the talk will explore how Blip Blip Blip's programme infiltrates the curriculum through its direct involvement with students, providing them with real-world experiences that could not be gained in as meaningful a way within the art school environment. Blip 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 grew out of two annual exhibitions that were established by myself and Jenny West in the 2007-2008 academic year. These exhibitions, X and Interim, continued to run as part of Blip Blip Blip's programme. Both these exhibitions acted to encourage and support the networks that young artists form as they progress through education. X featured former Leeds College of Art Foundation students who'd studied in the fine art pathway. The exhibition selection involved Jenny and I visiting the BA graduation exhibitions of former students at art schools and universities throughout the country. Interim was selected from second-year BA Fine Arts students who'd formerly studied on the foundation course at Leeds College of Art. It was selected each year by a leading artist and curator from a digital application. Selectors have included Katie Patterson, Pavel Buckler, Lisa Lefebvre, and Kira Phillips. X and Interim were established in order to reconnect artists now based in other cities with each other and with Leeds. Importantly, these exhibitions also functioned as a resource for current foundation students. It enabled them to see the work of students and graduates from a range of leading BA Fine Art courses. These two exhibitions served to place the current foundation students in dialogue with graduating artists and allowed them to become part of this extended network. Blip Blip Blip's first period at Leeds College of Art moved beyond X and Interim to develop a programme spanning the academic year running from August 2011 to September 2012. It was based at the Vernon Street site of Leeds College of Art, the building which housed the foundation course. We consider Blip Blip Blip's remit to be solely that of a contemporary art programme. However, as the programme was housed within a broad-based College of Art and Design, it gradually fell out of line with the college's exhibitions policy. This led to a meeting with the directors of East Street Arts, who offered Blip 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 the use of the project space at Patrick Studios for a 12-month period from January 2013. This coincided with the artist Harry Meadley moving back to Leeds from London. Harry was an ex-student who'd shown in the very first interim exhibition and had also been included in a subsequent ex-show. Since October 2012, Harry Meadley and I have been the co-directors of Blip Blip Blip. The relocation to Patrick Studios in January 2014 allowed Harry and I to reflect upon Blip Blip Blip's first manifestation at Leeds College of Art. We subsequently determined to develop a programme with a curatorial focus on the interface between contemporary art practice and art education. This would allow us to increase the participation and the involvement of the foundation students with the programme. We decided that all of the exhibitions at Blip 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 would be installed and invigilated by a team of foundation students who would volunteer their time at the beginning of the fine art pathway. These volunteers would also be involved in helping artists to realise works. They'd also be given the opportunity to curate the final exhibition of each year's programme after their own academic year had finished. Beyond Ex and Interim, 3 particular exhibitions previously staged at Leeds College of Art informed the future direction of the programme. Each of these exhibitions had involved students in a number of different ways beyond simply being the audience for an exhibition. In August 2011, Alex Farrer made the exhibition Catalogue Available. Catalogue Available revealed historical works embedded and hidden within the Art College's Vernon Street building, made by previous occupants over a 50-year period. For instance, works made directly on a wall and then subsequently painted out before the next academic year began, yet which still physically existed under multiple layers of paint. To complete the work, Alex worked with a group of foundation students from the 2010-2011 academic year. Through carrying out interviews with alumni and with past and present tutors, the foundation students were responsible for collecting information and stories about these hidden works. The sites of the works were identified by the student researchers and were then photographed for the exhibition catalogue. These student researchers also sourced a period photograph for each work from their informants. For the duration of the show, the foundation student Georgia Dennison led visitors on tours of the found exhibition, recounting stories of these former works hidden under the white walls and grey floors in their different locations throughout the building. The catalogue, limited to an edition of 1, is now housed in the college library. The students involved in this project were exposed to strategies for art making far beyond their previous experience. Their ongoing relationship with Alex over the period of the project allowed them to appreciate the rigour required to successfully realise projects of this nature. They further gained an understanding of the history of the building that they were students in and its relationship to developments in art education, giving them a sense of continuum. The exhibition, August 2002, Ongoing and Back, took place in November 2011. It grew out of a year-long weekly correspondence in letter form between Rebecca Wilcox, then a committee member at Transmission Gallery in Glasgow, and Laura Smith, a curator at Tate St Ives. Rebecca and Laura had previously been foundation students in Leeds before studying together at Glasgow School of Art on the Environmental Art Programme. Several of the artists involved in this exhibition made works that involved the foundation students in different ways. Lucy Clout made Ben Walker is the art student most like an art student, a work that she'd originally made as a foundation student herself, Lucy sent a long email to all the students on the foundation course, explaining how this work had come about. The email explained that she'd been making work which copied her previous works, self-plagiarism as she termed it. She finished by saying that this work would be awarded to the student who sent her the most convincing email that they wanted it. The students found that receiving this email from an established artist in the early stages of their foundation course was both exciting and engaging. Jan Sternberg and Sam Kennedy, two artists based in Stockholm, made a collaborative work for the show. The project involved a foundation student carrying out library-based research in Leeds and then forwarding this material to Stockholm. The work centered around the double meaning of the word object, the noun, a material thing, and the verb to object. Jans and Sam made a version of the Henry Moore sculpture, which is located outside Leeds City Art Gallery, as a piece of jewellery. Strandberg and Kennedy's scaled down Henry Moore was developed from a photograph uncovered by the student researcher of the sculpture when it was covered with a sheet in order to protect it during a public demonstration. The piece of jewellery, a weighty necklace in cast copper, was to be worn by the college principal throughout the period of the exhibition. Under the terms of a contract signed by both artist and the principal, students of the college and the wider public could, by appointment, view this work. The artists hoped that the necklace would be worn at critical moments when decisions were being taken, and that it would encourage conversation between the senior management and the students. In April 2012, Phil Nicol and Mike Crowther were invited to make an exhibition at Blip, Blip, Blip. Whilst Phil and Mike had known each other for many years, this was the first time that they'd exhibited together. Mike Crowther had studied at Leeds College of Art in the early 1960s. He later taught at the college before moving to Cardiff, where he eventually became head of painting. Mike had taught Phil Nicol, who was by now also teaching in the painting department at Cardiff. At Blip, 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 we began to see that two-person shows focusing on the different sorts of meaningful relationships that artists develop with other artists could also be a way of foregrounding the sorts of networks and associations that students can build during their time in education. This led to the Doubles series. The Doubles series is now one of the main curatorial strands at Blip, Blip, Blip. Doubles is a series of exhibitions in which Blip, Blip, Blip asks a mid-career artist to invite another artist with whom they have some form of artistic and educational relationship to make an exhibition with them. The first exhibition in the Doubles series saw Peter Liversidge ask Levin Hegel to exhibit with him. The exhibition contained individual works by both Peter and Levin. They also made their first collaborative work for this show at Blip, Blip, Blip. Levin's been Peter's studio assistant for the past 10 years. Students helped Peter and Levin to install the exhibition, and Peter also asked a group of students to produce a pair of silkscreen prints for him in an edition of 500. 4 months later, Peter asked the same students to produce a new print in an edition of 2000 as part of his contribution to the exhibition The Spirit of Utopia at the Whitechapel Gallery in London. The students who editioned Liversidge's prints felt a sense of empowerment as they became connected with artists and galleries based in other cities. The types of educational relationships foregrounded in the Doubles series have differed greatly. Stuart Bennett exhibited with his PhD student Lindsay Mann. Wang Crew showed with Robin Jenkins. Robin and Wan have been sixth form students together at Atlantic College in South Wales. Whilst the series normally asks a mid-career artist to invite another, often younger artist with whom they have some form of artistic relationship, the collaborative partnership, the Hook Project, nominated the much more established Art and Language. Throughout their time at art school, Art and Language have been an important reference point for the Hook Project. Dean Hughes invited Annetta Heyer. Annetta had taught Dean at Chelsea, and he now taught alongside Annetta at Edinburgh College of Art. Lucy Clout invited her mum, Claire Charnley. Lucy is a former Leeds Foundation student who currently teaches at Goldsmiths. she was included in Art Now at Tate Britain and won the Jerwood Film and Video Award in 2015. Claire Charnley was shortlisted for the 2008 Northern Art Prize and until 2015 taught at Leeds Beckett University. Jenny West teaches at Leeds College of Art. Jenny taught Ian Jackson when he was a foundation student in 2010 before Ian went to Edinburgh College of Art to study on the intermediate programme. Ian now has a studio in Leeds again, and he and Jenny are in regular dialogue. Rory Macbeth invited Laura Lord. Laura and Rory have been foundation students together at Central St Martin's in 1997. At CSM, they invented a fictitious foundation student known as Frances Neal. Without the knowledge of the teaching staff, Frances Neal was officially enrolled on the foundation course. Laura and Rory then proceeded to produce all of the work that was attributed to this fictitious student. Through rumour and hearsay, they managed to keep Frances Neal alive in the imagination of the students and the staff. Over 20 years later, the original creators of Frances Neal revisited their differing memories of the events surrounding her short life through their conversations and through facsimiles of the remaining documentation. Rory Macbeth is an artist and is the programme leader of fine art at Liverpool John Moores University. Laura Lord is now the Associate Director of the London Gallery, Sadie Cole's HQ.
So from this point, what I'd like to talk about is how once we moved to Patrick Studios and operated in their project space, this initial first year at least meant we produced 13 exhibitions within one calendar year. And as a result, allowed us to be quite playful and open in how we expanded the programme. An initial part of it was the continuation of the X and interim shows. In this case, the first X show was curated positionally within the gallery on a first come, first served basis, a strategy which was successful both in terms of making all the work arrive quickly during the install, but also giving over control to the students themselves to make these decisions, though ultimately that may not have been visually apparent. One of the things with interim, well, X and interim particularly, was in the act of bringing past foundation students back to Leeds to re-exhibit, was them interacting with the current foundation students. As a one-year course, it's quite rare that students actually build relationships with alumni. So X and interim became a sort of vital point in which they would return back and interact with the students, quite often coming in to do tutorials, sitting in crits. And through the programme, we wanted to sort of cement that a little bit more. With these series of exhibitions, we built up quite a sort of library almost of catalogues produced with pretty much most of the exhibitions, and with X and interim, that was always an important strategy. With interim, we actually invited current students to interview the exhibiting artists, so we put them directly in dialogue, often being quite thoughtful about who to pair up. This is just one of the further examples of X moving into it. What was also necessary is demonstrating a wide range of media, a wide range of types of working, again, as a way to re-cement that there are multiple approaches to art making, something that often art students in the early stages may not have had previous exposure to. Even these sort of incredibly laborious or laboriously committed performance works as well, which I think the students who invigilated alongside this performance, in which Simone Barnes manually moved a clock in real time, I think again, maybe tried to demonstrate some of the sort of rigor and efforts required to sort of successfully pull off certain works. In 2015, as this programme continued, we went from an initial year of 13 exhibitions in 1 year, which by all means was way too many and a task I would not attempt to try and again. to a sort of shorter, doing 4 or 5 exhibitions throughout the academic year. As such, we decided that we would start to conglomerate some of the exhibitions. In this case, we mixed the doubles show with interim. The 2 artists, in this case, Kira Phillips and Edwin Pickstone. Kira Phillips at that time was shortlisted for the Turner Prize, and Edwin Pickstone works within the printmaking workshop in Glasgow School of Art where Kira works. And this was a sort of, even though he'd helped produce her work, they'd not actually worked collaboratively prior to this. On top of this, Kira and Edwin exhibiting their work, they also acted as the selectors for interim to exhibit in the same exhibition as the students they were exhibiting. And in this case, their work sort of, the work that they collaboratively developed acted to encapsulate the works of the students, creating a sort of quite complex, if anything, relationship between selector, artist, and the idea of a sort of curatorial model. Further to this, the works, well, the large-scale installation of their work was installed by the students. And one thing that I think being able to observe during this was that the installation periods, particularly when the artists were working with the students, often on quite large-scale installations, is the conversations that happen very organically and naturally, and also informally, became noticeably quite significant for a lot of the students. Again, for this exhibition, the students produced a silk-screened editioned work, continuing this idea that Kira and Edwin had done using sort of anagrams. In this case, they'd re-anagrammed the name of doubles and interim to bloused and mintier. We quite liked the title of mintier for the following year in 2016, and so switched interim to be called mintier. And this also paralleled the decision to no longer make X and interim exclusive to past Leeds College of Art Foundation students, but to all students throughout the UK. So as a more maybe sort of public facing gallery, or wanting to make it more independent from this, we opened it out this year, selected by Claire Charnley and Lucy Clow. And again, they worked and exhibited alongside the students that they had selected for, in this case, Mintier. The same can be said for X, which in its 10th edition, we sort of like the iPhone X, just made into the character X. And this was selected from graduates from with not necessarily coming from Leeds Foundation course, but from out the country. And in this case, we invited selectors to make this. In this case, it was Juan Cruz, who was at the time Dean of Royal College of Art and currently Principal of Edinburgh College of Art, and Sally Talent, who at the time was Director of the Liverpool Biennial and now current Director of the Queen's Museum in New York. And so part of this, as much as it was making a graduate show as such, we felt it was necessary also to invite selectors and relatively high profile, or I should say not even relatively high profile selectors, to put the attention and consideration into a sort of group graduate show. And I think this is something that we chose to extend much more into the programme itself, which was, we thought of the policy really that most of our shows would be an invitation to another curator or artist or organisation to produce exhibitions for Blip Blip Blip. We often operated with next to no budget or a very limited budget. And one of the things we realised we could offer was the space for experimentation and for very little constraints really on what the curators or artists or projects would realise that we and the team of student volunteers would be able to support the fabrication and production and realisation of. So some of the examples of the projects that existed under Blip Blip Blip. The first here is the Doug Bowen Prize. And this was an art prize developed, offered to Leeds College of Art Foundation students as a prize, in which the prize awarded was a solo exhibition. organised by Doug Bowen, who at the time, or I think he was on his PGCE placement possibly at the time, and went on to teach there, and now in fact teaches at Moscow.
I'm gonna start with this slide. It represents the catalog that actually Harry designed, and a bit of a story behind it. So Moscow Calling, it's a project that was initially initiated by Sean and supported by Ian Hartron, a course leader for MA painting at the Manchester School of Art. And it's happened in the summer of 2018 when Sean was back in UK, and he shared the images of the foundation show that happened this summer, and Ian suggested that it would be great to do some collaboration. So he selected the participating students from seeing the images of that final show, and he also organized a critique of the exhibition with staff and students from Manchester School of Art, and that kind of introduced a range of other parties that actually helped with the project. Ian also organized for our students from Moscow to visit the Chatham Library, and it's actually one of the oldest free public reference library in the UK, and it's the place where Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels met regularly in Manchester back in 1845. So that became part of the research project that students took while they were there. And also it's important to say that basically what Marx and Engels did in the library was ultimately led to the kind of Communist Manifesto, and that has a direct link to the Hutumas school that actually formed the avant-garde movement in the early first part of the 20th century. And that could have been a link to the idea of the foundation course, which has kind of formed in the British art education and then been introduced to Russian education for over 10 years now. So the Moscow Calling project has involved in an exhibition that was hosted at the PS Maribel, and it's a project space in the center of Manchester, and it was partnered with the Manchester School of Art and the British High School of Art. And as I said, Sean and Ian were in the center of the organizational process, and actually the whole initiative came from their dialogue and their kind of idea that it would be great to build up that relationship and that link. So Moscow Calling became a joint project for the Blip Blip Blip, PS Maribel, and also for the Bunker Gallery initiative. And also thanks to the Richard Ward and Jack Dow, because they allowed to host it at the PS Maribel. And it's also worth to mention that they suggested that the artistic collective Cut Flap, who actually run the Bunker Gallery at PSM Maribel, would also be involved. So the group actually, they were recent graduates from the Manchester School of Art, and they actually helped a lot in the email correspondence with our students, and also that actually became part of the catalog text that was published, and the image that we saw just earlier on. And as I said, Harry was the person that did the design for the catalog. So in terms of the works, the students, 6 students from the British High School of Art and Design that were selected by Ian, they actually went on to the Manchester, and they showed some of the works that actually been shown during the foundation show, as well as some new works that they created for the exhibition in Manchester. And the show included different types of projects and works that Moscow students were developing throughout their foundation year, as well as carrying on during the summer before joining their BA programs. And we see that they're exploring all sorts of art mediums like performance, painting, photography, sculpture, and others. And for instance, in that work, Yelizaveta Kuzikova, she explored the theme of relationship between the human and the nature, and that actually resulted in that documentation of performance that she carried out and then showed for her final show on the foundation. Anna Piltsova, she showed very interesting paintings that were actually the kind of representation of common objects. And they were a floor hutch from Moscow, and then also the one from Manchester. So it was a kind of a dialogue with the environment and the idea of exploration of things that normally not being kind of attracted. And she mentioned that she always were interested in that ordinary or boring aspects, and she tried to explore it in her works. So Olga Popova, she were always interested in this emotional involvement in the work, and she mentioned that it's extremely important for her. And she developed that idea that working on an eyesight condition is interesting, and it's connected with the perception issues. So this kind of a blur effect was very interesting, and she tried to again reflect that in her work. So this is the 2 images that were shown in an exhibition, and that kind of a feel of surprise was very much interesting for her. So the next stage was the Moscow Calling 2, which was supposed to happen early this May. So it should have been a second round, and again it should have been at the PSR Maribor, and it would have been with the partnership with Manchester School of Art, and Dr. Marcus Coffey selected the works. He's a senior lecturer and the program leader for fine art at the Manchester School of Art. And also Tim Brennan, the professor, head of the Faculty of Art, written an introduction essay for the Moscow Calling 2. And at the moment, it's been postponed due to the current circumstances, but there is a dialogue happening between the Moscow students and Manchester students. So 8 Moscow from British High School of Art and Design do not have the opportunity yet to travel to Manchester to realize the project. However, they're in conversation and talking with the 8 students from Manchester in order to build up the catalog and being represented on the blip website, and then hopefully in the near future might be represented at the Future Lab in Shanghai, which hopefully Manchester School of Art, as well as the British High School of Art and the Moscow School of Contemporary Art, will take place in November. And as I mentioned before, at the moment we can't be sure about the dates of the project when it's going to be realized, but the project itself is continuing and conversation is happening, and students working on their projects and hoping once this is over they would be able to realize it. So for instance, this project by Natalia Azamasova, who is currently studying on the BA photography at the British High School of Art and Design, has shown part of the project at our school earlier this winter, and she's showing those silhouettes of a district in Moscow, and it's kind of famous for its experimental Soviet time architecture, and she was kind of shooting it from a warm vantage point. And that gave this kind of an interesting view and the kind of scale of the object. And then she translated it into this kind of silhouettes and kind of non-existing architectural places. So again, Natalia has been continuing to work on that and thinking how that can be further developed and shown as part of the Moscow Calling 2. In terms of the participating of the Manchester School of Art students, Sean and I have been looking at the applicants, and we also selected 8 level 5 students, BA Fine Art students, that should now been undertaking the kind of micro residency and the exhibition called Transmitter in Moscow. And we have agreed with the ZIL Cultural Center that it would been hosting the exhibition that should have opened in May, but hopefully it's been postponed, and in a very near future the exhibition will be realized. But for now, it needs to be said that we decided to get involved 8 level 5 Russian, our students from BHSAD, and they're in conversation and writing, and students are writing instructions, so the work could be realized here. by the, so Manchester students is writing instructions and explaining to Moscow students how the work should have been done and should have been produced. And then hopefully, once the lockdown is finished, we should be able to show the results of that conversation and that kind of a project development. And again, hopefully that this very unusual type of residencies would then result in creation of works and then would travel to the Future Lab and be shown at Shanghai. I also probably need to mention why I became part of that project and why Sean and Harry and I started the conversation and decided that it would be an interesting idea to join our forces. I've been working at the British High School of Art and Design for almost 10 years. And I started as a foundation tutor on fine art, as well as doing some work for BA Fine Art. And then in 2016, I started my CPD program in contemporary art. And from that on, I always thought that it would be great on the basis of the British High School of Art and Design to start a new school which would completely focus on development of contemporary art scene in Moscow, as well as development of different programs and courses that would be dedicated to the theme of contemporary art. So we've been working closely with Sean. Our desks is actually very close to each other in staff room, and we've been having conversation and thinking how the art scene and the development of the contemporary art programs here could be developed. And Sean shared with me his experience and his ideas, and obviously this great initiative that's been done with Moscow Calling. And we thought that it would be great to try and realize the blip, blip, blip in Moscow, in Russia, within the new school, and having to really expand on what happens within the Russian art scene, within the Moscow art scene, as well as to building up the conversation between Moscow and other important centers and important cities within the map of contemporary art. So because we recently launched this new school, as well as we're planning to launch a project space for the school, and that should be done in a collaboration with the Winzavod, which is a contemporary center, art center in the heart of Moscow. And it has been operating for over almost 15 years. So we thought that it might be one of the best possible locations where that could be realized. So we've been having several conversations thinking of how to address blip, blip, blip. And we came to the point that it would be a really unique place to showcase the work of really international artists and art students from Moscow and leading UK art academies, and sort of positioning the school and what we do here along the leading centers of international art education. We also thought that Blip 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 would be functioning as well as the exhibition and curatorial program, and also as a kind of educational enrichment program for students that we're educating here. It would definitely enable students to volunteer and kind of supplement what they do in terms of the curriculum, and becoming active kind of members of the blip 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 program. We thought that it would really give this type of experience of exhibition making, and also encourage students to be very active and engage with the real aspects of the contemporary artwork. So we established that this connection of young art students and having that kind of network of artists from international standing, it would really give this platform for a dialogue between students and established artists, and that would show this kind of important relationship and networking within not just Moscow but worldwide. So the Winzavod and the blip 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 and the school, as I said, would be aiming to foster the relationship between art practice and art education. And I really hope, and I'm very grateful for Sean and Harry that they agreed to participate and to actually start the project, hopefully in September in Moscow. And we thought that it would be great to invite Harry over and would host and create a first project, a first exhibition of blip blip blip, because as Harry being a co-director of the blip 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 and also being in conversation and dialogue with us, I think it would be a great start for our new project. And going back to the tradition of what been established within the blip blip blip, Harry, Sean and I thought that it would be great to carry on those double exhibitions. So Harry has invited Harriet Rose Morley to join him in that first exhibition. And Harriet was she was a student at the foundation course at Leeds College of Art back in 2013. And she also volunteered when it was at the Patrick Studio during that year. Further, then she went on to study on environmental art program in Glasgow. And now she's living in Netherlands, and Harry had a conversation with her and she kindly agreed and thought that it would be great to come over and do that. So I'm very excited and very grateful for my colleagues that they agreed to do that, and hopefully in a very near future you would see those exciting developments, and hopefully we'll be able to come and join us for the opening and the exhibition. Thank you.
I apologize for losing connection. My Wi-Fi seems to have chosen to cut off mid-talk, and I'm currently using my iPhone's hotspot connection. So fingers crossed we can return to this section and I can go through it. I think just before going into this, just to follow up on Sean and Misha's invitation for me and to inaugurate the programme with a double show and selecting Harriet is, I think what the hope is in doing so, ignoring maybe too much nepotism, but is the idea to start off the programme in a way that can sort of carry on the ethos that we developed through that. And I think one of the key ethos of the programme was that it was this extracurricular activity that really sort of benefited the students that were a part of it. And I feel like Harriet was one of the sort of key members of the first team of volunteers. I think she was sort of the head organizer, if I remember correctly, and has gone on to develop a really sort of fascinating practice in her own right. That I think that sort of maybe shares a lot of those values and shares the idea of sort of collective working and collective making. So that's what we'll hope to set off in terms of really starting the programme with the new bunch of student volunteers being really sort of key and central to the development of that work. So returning to where I was up to in our previous programming, and I think I was halfway into talking about School of the Damned. Again, I think where we can think about ethos and the ideas of alternatives to the standard models of education, School of the Damned was an alternative MA set up by a group of people. Maybe originally could have been discussed as a protest against maybe some of the fees or limited accessibility to some of the MA courses for various artists at the time. And so established their own unaccredited program that still runs to this day, and really has sort of boasted quite an amazing set of visiting artists, visiting lecturers, and runs a really rich program. And so it was quite an honor in a sense that through Blip we were able to host their first ever exhibition. I think I already covered that bit. Another organisation that again existed outside of an obvious or what we might call a sort of traditional art education model was the Institute of Jamais Vu that was set up in London in 2012, I believe, or possibly even 2010, which was established by a group of maybe the majority were past Leeds Foundation students who had gone on to various London BA courses and decided in their second year to rent a sort of large industrial unit where they would live together, but also established a gallery space within the centre of that known as the Institute of Jamais Vu. This ran from 2010 to 2014. And we sort of invited them to host I guess a retrospective exhibition. And what developed was the exhibition Thunderdome, that sought to recreate all 20 exhibitions that happened under the Institute of Jamais Vu programme, where the actual walls of the original gallery were transported from London up to Leeds, reassembled within our gallery space, and then all the works that had ever been exhibited were recreated in fiberboard, filling the space with the gallery and with the archive. As maybe those of you that are familiar with the Mad Max series and the Thunderdome, they had the very nice press release line of 20 shows enter, 1 show leaves, which I'm still quite envious of to this day. I think a lot of credit should be said to the Institute of Jamais Vu, and it was, in a sense, felt very a bit like a homecoming maybe, that we could bring it back in as a final thing within the Blip programme, because the students that set up Institute of Jamais Vu acted as a sort of recurring influence for current foundation students, as a way of really seeing how you don't need to wait until after graduation to establish things and build up programs and build a profile, which sort of almost all of the artists involved in the Institute of Jamais Vu have gone on to do really sort of amazing things. Something else that we, through the Blip programme, were able to instigate was the exhibition Fully Awake, curated by Sean Kaye and Ian Hartshorn for an organisation called Teaching Painting. And this was the first in what's gone on to be a series of exhibitions that really look at the intergenerational approach to art education in relation to painting, and somewhat uses a model akin to the double series, but makes it a triple series. So the members of staff from every, I think Sean might be able to correct me, but I think every single BA fine art course in the country that work in painting were invited to contribute to the series of exhibitions and exhibited alongside an artist who had taught them and then someone who they have taught previously. So it creates a sort of vast web of influence catalogued throughout the series of exhibitions. Yeah, and so by the end of the cycle, which I know was set to have its final show, I believe this month at the Holden Gallery in Manchester and will be staged later, has exhibited the work of over 200 artists and 70 educational art institutions over the last 3 years. A particular example from this, which I think I still to this day really wish I owned this work, by Andrew Grassi, an artist who teaches at City and Guilds in London, a very well-established artist. He invited John Steziker, who had taught him contextual studies at St. Martin's, and James Tadbush, who he had taught at City and Guilds. Andrew Grassi produces these paintings during the installation of exhibitions. And so here, prior to the show, came up with the two works, installed them in the space in time to produce this painting that then is re-hung opposite the works when they're realized. And again, is a nice cementing visually of the idea of the relationships wanting to be sort of explored and exposed through this series of exhibitions. Another thing from our program that we were fortunate to sort of host the inaugural version of was an exhibition, Tumultuous Noise, that had actually been organised by a small group of graduates from Leeds Metropolitan University, now Leeds Beckett University, where I currently teach. And it featured a re-hosting of the 2011 Fine Art Degree Show. So every student who exhibited in that degree show were invited back to re-exhibit together. But the nice twist that they put on it was that it wasn't just to present works of the students who have still necessarily continued an art practice, but to present something that might be representative of what they've gone on to do. So it had a sort of very open and expanded sense of what art practices can lead into. And the idea with this is that it will recycle every 6 years. So I have to do the maths, but the idea that it becomes an anthology of the, you know, maybe the artistic developments, but also the life and career development of a graduating year. Maybe we'll host the next one in Moscow. Glasgow to Leeds, Leeds to Glasgow. This sort to, I guess a lot of what we've done involved inviting selectors and things, especially through Ex and Interim. And with this, we thought it would be interesting to reverse that. And this became an exhibition thought up by the group of students who were volunteering with us that year. And they curated an exhibition, or they selected an exhibition from an open call made to students on the BA Fine Art programme at Glasgow School of Art, but they as foundation students acted as the selectors. Those students, the foundation students acting as selectors, were all going to start at Glasgow School of Art in the forthcoming academic year. And so through this exhibition, it was able to preemptively start to build those relationships. So those students already had exhibited the work of various students or seen an extended applicant list of students from that course, sort of inverting the traditional hierarchy. Returning to Alex Farrer, we wanted to invite him to develop a project with us. As Sean had said earlier in the talk, his original catalogue available, one of the first programs, set a very sort of interesting precedent for how we develop the program. And he at the time had just started at the Rijksacademie in Amsterdam, a non-academic, I can't remember quite how they phrase it. It's a non-academic residency or non-academic art institution, a 2-year residency for international artists, really quite amazing. And so he invited 4 artists, fellow residents at the Rijksacademie, to produce an exhibition, but with the caveat that it had to be realized by the student volunteers at Blip, Blip, Blip back in Leeds. So we organized a trip in which 16 of the students went over to Amsterdam and spent time with each, in sort of small groups, with each of the 4 artists set to exhibit, in which those artists sort of spoke with, trained, developed through workshops or through practical sort of sessions, working with the students so they could reproduce the works back in Leeds for the exhibition. And after that initial trip over to Amsterdam, they really maintained quite a lot of dialogue and interviews, and it was quite ambitious, in fact, in terms of what was realized. So just to go back to that, this is where we were at the Rijksacademie. That's a Gertenbach, and then the work realized within the gallery. Tamar Harpaz, who would last year exhibit again in Leeds at the Henry Moore Institute as part of the Yorkshire Sculpture International, the work she developed involved the students acting as Foley artists to do a performance of a live soundtrack to a video work that she'd produced. And to expand out of the exhibitions program, in 2017, we held a 1-day symposium entitled "What's a Studio and How Do We Use One?" Something that I think in lots of different ways, especially for art students and maybe more so for recent graduates, understanding what a studio is, how it operates, what the benefits and maybe what the pitfalls of such a thing was. And so the idea was a symposium to explore that. It was quite a good day, actually. And so the speakers included Martin Youth, Programme Director of Fine Art at Chelsea College of Art, Swan Cruz, who I've mentioned earlier, current principal, I believe, of Edinburgh College of Art. Phil Mayer, who is the studio manager for the artist Ryan Gander, gave a pretty sort of scarily insightful talk about how Ryan's studio works. Jenny Dunsheath, author of Artist Boff Anthony Caro's Studio Assistants and Issues of Legacy in British Sculpture. Surf, an artist collective and studios within Leeds, Rogue Artist Studios in Manchester, and the Northern Charter in Newcastle, all had delegates who would speak about how they operated and the different things like that. And it actually sought to bring, I think, quite a lot of groups together that maybe prior to that hadn't had as much shared conversation about how they operate. So that symposium, What is a Studio and How Do We Use One?, fed into the following exhibition, developed by No Working Title, project run by Joe Addison and Natasha Kidd, artists and educators, that's run in various locations. And if I remember quite correctly, out of the symposium, an extended invite to all sorts of artists and educators around the world was a simple question of what, I think it was, what do you do in a studio? Or maybe I'm paraphrasing. And from these set of instructions, the students would recreate and carry out these within the project space. And they would sort of interpret them and build the exhibition throughout it. When we did our first year of programming in 2013, it felt maybe necessary, or it felt sort of interesting to offer one of the exhibition slots to our student volunteers to curate an exhibition. And that's something that we'd continued in various ways throughout the program. But the inaugural one, I can sort of recall me and Sean discussing like how well will I don't know how good of an exhibition will come out of that. And so it was quite an experiment. In fact, looking back, is sort of maybe one of the more ambitious or unusual exhibitions that was hosted. And it was titled blip.co.uk/current.html, and existed as a part online and part in the gallery space exhibition, or the gallery space mimicked the presentation that was made online. And again, this linked to the notion of artist studios, and they invited various artists, including Rachel Adams, Simon Bedwell, Lucy Clout, Alex Farrer, Phil Nicol, and Paul Rooney, and various others, to install webcams in their studios for the duration of the exhibition. And these were relayed live, and so visitors to the gallery or visitors to the website were able to sort of watch the activities within the studios and maybe expose the reality of how little activity sometimes happens in artist studios. And further to this, they continued what we hope to establish as a tradition of building up a set of catalogues and texts, and conducted interviews with all the artists whose webcams sort of trying to increase the amount of dialogue, which I guess, if anything, trying to surmise the intention or the hopes for the Blip programme is, at least from my perspective, really about encouraging conversation and generating points of contact for conversation, predominantly for the students who are actively volunteering their time to the programme, but also to the extended artists, artist groups, organisations, curators, all sorts of people that we're able to invite to contribute to the programme. So just as a sort of slight summation, I guess, to the programme, at the time that we had to, or that it had to be sort of kicked out, let's say, of Vernon Street at Leeds College of Art, the original Blip programme, re-establishing it outside of the art school became really fundamental, I think, to part of really what we might consider a success of the project, just in the fact that the students were engaging in an activity physically removed from the studio of the art school. I think it made it more real, and it made the relationships between student and artist not that of a visiting artist hosting a tutorial with a student and that sort of hierarchy system, but it was a shared collaborative act that was far more informal, and I hope, or it felt at least, a lot more enriching an experience for a lot of the students, or at least more eye-opening to some of the realities of artistic practices. And I think it maybe doesn't go, well, I would like to think that the students that really, or quite generously, I guess, offered their time and support to helping us realise this, did get a quite rich experience from the project. And I think it's nice, at least, to in part start to see the legacy of that with a lot of the students who volunteered with us, and how that supported their development. And I think it's nice that we're able to continue the programme in a way that can continue bringing people back into that conversation and exploring it even further. So I know this is where I was originally supposed to pass over to Misha, but I'd like to thank you all very much for bearing with me. And I think we're going over to questions and answers at the minute. Thank you.
Yeah, so I did say at the beginning that it was going to have a bit of a collage aesthetic to it, and I think it ended up having more of a collage aesthetic to it than I'd initially envisaged. But we've got to the end of it, and I think there are some questions, and we'll try and. Well, I said there's some questions. There might just be.
Interestingly, we have a series of comments in the question thing saying we've been hacked by Russian hackers. So,
but I think the first one would be David McLevy asked. He would be interested to find out more about some of the particular challenges that you, Sean, and Harry experienced when performing Blip Blip Blip. Have there been any difficulties when placing students with artists when thinking about sharing control of certain artistic decisions like installation, layouts, etc.?
Well, I don't know if it was ever really too much of a challenge. I think what was interesting in the very first exhibition that we hosted at Patrick Studios, the Peter Liversidge and Levin Hegel double show, for the install of that, or mine, Peter Liversidge's work works for a series of proposals that are then realised. And he gave quite a lot of control over to the students to think about the positioning, the installation, and sort of some of the considerations within the show. And I think where students were given more autonomy or more control over that part of the process, I mean, if anything, definitely rose to the challenge. But I think being given the weight of that decision, they always took it really seriously, sometimes probably more seriously than the artist or myself or Sean curating a show would do. So I don't know, I can't recall any issues or things that really became difficult. If anything, I think as time went on, we wanted more and more. Alex's influencer show with the Rijksacademy artists was a great example of that, where the students became sort of sole producers of the work. And I think where they had more control over that, the better results we had, I think, from the students' experience.
Yeah.
Shall I read out the next one, or do you want Sean to add something?
No, I think the next one is David again saying an additional question is, why do you think this model has not been adopted by more art schools / public galleries? And I don't, well, obviously it initially did exist within an art school, but I think Harry and I both felt that it was more successful when it took place outside the art school, when it was independent and wasn't in the art school building. Why have more people not adopted it? I really don't know. Although we did run on no budget whatsoever, so we were reliant on artists' goodwill. We were putting up artists at our flats and our houses, but we were reliant on. We had no Arts Council funding or anything, so we were very reliant. East Street Arts kindly gave us the space, so we had the space for free. But outside of that, we had no funding. So maybe that's one thing, is that. People find it difficult to do things without funding, but we found a way to make that work over an extended period of time.
Yeah, I think the short answer is that maybe there aren't as many masochistic staff as myself and Sean on courses.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I think it comes out of the very individual initiatives. I think it's hard to see institutions as such are taking that much responsibility for such projects. I think it's more of when you see personalities, again, like Harry and Sean, that understood the great aspects of such particular practice, and actually, without relying on I don't know, finances from art schools and institutions, just did it with their personal contacts and the relationship with all those artists, and knowing those students, and really, fostering with their enthusiasm. And I think it's just a great example that great things can be done with no real kind of support from institutions, but actually with the support of friends and co-minders. So the next question is by Henry Ward. So Henry is lovely collage presentation with lots of exciting content. So much of the content feels like it relates to education. How important do you think the relationship between making, curating, and teaching is?
Certainly the whole idea behind the sort of what Harry and I thought has been the remit of Blip 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 was that it was connecting contemporary art practice to art education. So in that sense, it was maybe trying to give students an understanding of how they might practice out. So they had a practice within the art school, within their studios, and they met art practicing artists who talked to them about their work in the studios. And maybe this was offering something else because they were seeing how artists would operate through installing and making shows, because they sometimes help artists realize works and as well as installing shows. And by being involved throughout an extended period of maybe 6 months with the programme, they sort of built up that understanding. So it wasn't just about talking about their individual practice with an artist, it was about understanding a wider practice.
Yeah, I'd add to, definitely agree, and I'd add to that that I mean, we could simplify it as that it's a sort of more vocational model of education, that it's sort of learning through active participation. But I mean, I could relate it to my experience prior to moving back to Leeds and getting involved in Blip. I'd been in London, and like most young artists in London, struggling for money and stuff, been doing lots of tech work, and through various galleries that I was working as a technician as, like that experience, you know, discussing things with the artists, sort of quietly observing a lot of stuff that goes on, was actually quite a valuable learning experience. And I think for students, something like that it's as much in what you pick up from, maybe osmosis is too fancy a term, but even just through observation or just witnessing, oh, how does things work? What are the tones of the conversations that happen when people are realizing these things? And so that idea of what the relationship between making, curating, and teaching, I think as a teaching exercise, it's healthy for students, and I think it's also healthy for probably all artists to have considerations about other artists' work, whether that's through the making of the work, whether that's through the exhibiting or installation of the work, but to shift your attention away from just your own practice can be a really enriching learning experience that you relate back to then thinking for your own work. So being exposed to as many different models of art making or artistic practice, the better, in my opinion. In terms of curating, I don't know whether me and Sean, we always were a bit hesitant, I think, to think or even describe ourselves as curators. And I don't know how much it was about curating, if not maybe a sort of like anti-curating to some degree.
Okay, I'll read Martin's out because I think it's interestingly worded, and maybe I'll let Harry and Misha answer it, but it's very, very nicely worded, Martin, thank you. It says, are you thinking of the current situation as just a blip? Or do you think that it will lead to a more fundamental review of curatorial practice for blip, blip, blip? Blip.
Harry, do you want me or do you want to?
Yeah, you go first. I'll have a think.
Right. Well, from our side, back here in Moscow, for the education and the art scene, I think the current situation is certainly can be described as blip. But we, as an institution, as a collaborative, as a kind of group, we certainly would like to see what we're starting to do is a blip, 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 blip. And I really hope that it's for definitely a really years to come, and also for the fact that it will really help to kind of turn and twist the art scene in Moscow, and the better integration of artists, younger artists in the international art scene. So that's a kind of a big aim, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I can only really relate it to my own situation within what's been described as the current situation. With Sean and Misha asking me and Harriet now to do the inaugural exhibition, is not knowing necessarily if it will definitely, or not if, but when it will definitely happen, and definitely if we'll be able to physically travel to partake in it, in which case, you know, a lot might need to be done remotely. And I think thinking about how Blip might operate from Moscow, but span more internationally, is considering how works or conversations can be achieved without necessarily international travel for every participant. So I think it being forged in this current time might set some interesting precedents for thinking about the internationality of the programme in future as well. But fingers crossed, we'd be able to have as much sort of in-person interaction, because I think that's always the most valuable sort of interaction through conversation you can have.
So Derek Austin, hi Derek. Derek says the model you're describing seems to imply that curating is the central activity, skill, question mark, in an art student's education, one that they need to learn as a part of learning to be an artist. Do you think this is the case? I think we tried to sort of answer that a little bit earlier, Derek, by saying that maybe what students, we certainly weren't trying to take away from what happens in art schools. I guess we were trying to offer something that added to that, rather than something that was just an alternative to that. Students were making work, their own practice in their studios in the art school, and they were in conversations with other students and with visiting artists and with the staff who taught there. And maybe we were trying to add something that was additional to that, not something that was alternative to that.
And I would also add that, you know, for a lot of students, the studying process and the studying environment, the school environment, is always a kind of a safe place. So, but I think it's good for them to have that experience of actually knowing and exposing to that kind of a more of a real scenario where they would actually interact and see how it actually happens. So having that experience would definitely make their own study process more valuable. So thinking for their future and what they might be doing in their professional practice would, I think, be a very great and valuable addition to their curriculum.
I think I'd add, I was just when I first read this question, I was a bit like, oh yeah, I'm not sure about. I mean, it's interesting that to word it in that way, or think that it's placing curation as an important part of an art student's education. And I actually do think it probably is a massively beneficial thing, not necessarily to learn about so you yourself can act curatorially, but I think a student that's able to gain the experience or be able to recognize the structures or activities that curation can impede onto an artist or onto artist works, or to sort of observe what curation does to the work an artist has made. And I think being able to get an experience of that, or to start having considerations or thinking about that, can only really, in my opinion, probably be beneficial to the student. I think being able to see the mechanisms at which that you have to place yourself operate is only going to be an advantage. And I also think that a lot of students who are on a fine art course, who are interested in art, aren't necessarily there with the intention to be an artist in their own right, but because of their natural sort of persuasion towards art and wanting to learn about art, it's a very common route into curation. And so I think, or at least maybe I'm going to annoy some curators, but I often think the more interesting curators I've come across are ones who've come out of a BA fine art education, or at least originally, and who have an understanding of art making. And I think there is quite a big proportion of fine art students who are interested in curation and otherwise wouldn't go the history of art traditional, sort of upper middle class route into it as was previously established. So maybe the answer is yes.
Right. Alexander Ilyashenko, who's our current student, is asking, can you as curators outline some benefits of working with students?
I think Harry rightly pointed out that maybe we wouldn't consider ourselves as curators in the sort of sense of the word that most people who are employed as a curator. I think we would see ourselves as artists and educators, but I think some interesting projects certainly occurred that we might not have put together by ourselves without the input of those students. So it's certainly allowed for a sort of broader range of experimentation and thinking.
And enthusiasm and energy that students can provide, and kind of hunger to be really involved at every stage of not just operating as installers or invigilators or helpers. So students always show a great enthusiasm, and that's probably the most important aspect from my side.
Maybe one for you.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Harry, go on.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I would just gonna add, I think that there's I won't necessarily put words in Sean's or Misha's mouth, but I think neither of us would necessarily have an interest in just running a gallery or just running an exhibitions program. I think that what Blip allowed us to do and hopefully encourage was the building of a in a sense, I mean, maybe it sounds a bit lame, but like the sort of building of a community and a network that transcends that initial interaction. So I mean, I would say the decision to invite Harriet to be in the double show comes out of the fact that from that initial experience of working with them both as a tutor, but also through doing Blip, you don't want the relationships you build with students just to be limited to the year or 3 years or whatever it may be that you're actively teaching them. I think that as artists in the wider world and the sort of artistic culture that we want to encourage and hope sort of proliferate is that you want that to continue on, and a lot of our program projects that have developed and ended up being artist or curated things are students who we had worked with in the past who have gone on to develop their own work and their own practices, and that you sort of re-establish those relationships, right? So I think a real benefit of being able to work with students, and especially with people very early on in that process, is that years down the line, those offer opportunities for all sorts of people and for yourself as well, right?
There's a question from Luke Mullen. It might be one for you, Misha. I don't know. Luke is saying, I'd like to ask if there exists a similar alternative art school movement in Russia. And I'm guessing you're talking about, Harry was talking about the School of the Damned, and I'm guessing that that's maybe what you're talking about. And Misha's probably got more idea what exists over here than I have.
Well, at the moment, if we talk about the art education in terms of contemporary art practice, there are not that many institutions that actually covering and providing experience for students to actually develop their understanding and knowledge in that field. There are still plenty of traditional institutes and academies which train students in a classical kind of Soviet type education. There are several small private schools, institutions that very much kind of build around the local art, kind of based on the maybe more of a kind of underground movement during the Soviet time, and the kind of a very non-connected to the kind of government state institution places, which they do offer some interesting alternatives, let's say that way, but I don't think they really translate and kind of deliver the more of an international understanding of contemporary art practice. So I guess one of the aims for our new school is try and expand and really get more involved with the international art community, and to make the links and to help students build up that more of a worldwide feel for what's it like, you know, doing and being involved in a kind of a international art practice.
Okay, Josh Johnson. Hi, Josh. Josh says, I think you described what this offers to students as supplementary and discussed the positive and the links, dialogues and experiences formed. Do you see this as something that should be additional to what students experience on a course, or something that is missing from or should be more integrated into what is covered in the wider curriculum? I did a talk with Ian Hartshorn a couple of weeks ago, which I think you were at, Josh, that was the Fully Awake talk through teaching painting. Some of this conversation was coming up there. Certainly my view on that was that actually all fine arts courses shouldn't look the same. I wouldn't want to say this is a curriculum that all fine art courses should adopt. I think that the fact that there are different curriculums on different courses is good, and I think this was just something that Harry and I did that was additional to it that students could do. But I certainly wouldn't want to be in a position where I was sort of saying to other institutions what their curriculum should include, because I think it's quite rich that one college's curriculum is perhaps very different from another. There's a comment from John Seth. John says, I think it's students themselves that initiate this kind of exhibition, certainly at undergraduate level. Sometimes there is funding support for this from the art schools. This also depends on the city, expenses of hiring space, etc. Henry Ward again. Henry says, thanks. it's an important aspect of what's missing without the experience of engaging in a program like this. Very inspiring, and I love the idea of being an anti-curator.
Yeah, big time.
Says also, you're right, Harry, anti-curating is the way forward. John, again, from my own experience, the process of doing this is to think about kinds of formations, how things are brought together, the deployment of frameworks that are not instrumental, within which the activity of curating, if we must use that word, takes place. Henry again. Henry says, again, it's about introducing audience and context. John again, John says anti-curation should be a part of the art school education. The replicating of models of curation is not it. Maybe it's something about like the uncuration. Derek says, your last point about the value of thinking about engaging with curation is really interesting one, Harry. Harriet Morley. Harriet's who's going to come and do the double show with Harry in Moscow. Harriet says, do you think blip, blip, blip has trained artists to be multifunctional as such? When you can't make art, you facilitate, curate. When you can't facilitate, you assist, almost mold to the different jobs or scenarios you have to be in to earn money or to continue to make art.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, actually. I mean, the question is whether blip, blip has trained artists to do anything. I guess it's only the students that partaked in it that could answer that. So yourself, Harriet, would probably have a better answer than me. I do think that understanding the realities of the art system or how you might need to navigate that, particularly as an art student or as a recently graduating artist, is really challenging. I think, you know, anyone that's been in that position will have had a difficult time with it. And so, I mean, I know I've implemented in terms of my teaching, or what I like to think about teaching, as equipping students with as many of those skills as possible, and hopefully with an attitude like the one that you describe. In fact, like, I think I feel like maybe the opposite or the challenge to that point would be that the students who were interested in partaking in blip, blip, blip and contributing to it and being part of it are probably the students who they themselves already, maybe it's within their personality that they like to be involved in things and they see the value in being involved in things. So I think maybe that's sort of already an attitude they may have had or not realized they had before choosing to volunteer their time and energy into being part of the program.
Okay, we've got one final comment on the Q&A list, and it's from Luke again. And Luke says, I think Harry's framed an interesting book title: How Curating Can Impede Artists.
I don't want to come off as down on curators. I have lots of great, or benefited a lot in terms of learning and thinking about art making through conversations with curators. But it's something you need to be aware of or know how to navigate. And again, thinking about that period of being a recent graduate, I know, quite a lot of people that have ended up in all sorts of complicated situations getting involved with galleries, mainly mid-level London commercial galleries, as recent graduates, mainly from MA courses and things, who have an incredibly difficult or complex time dealing with all that. So I think that making an awareness, or at least giving an offer of an experience into what could be considered, or what I would hope is considered good practice, that I think we always try to do through our program, and how we involve the students that contributed to it. Yeah, you do have to watch out for curators, though. That's true.
One crew's just offered another quite interesting take on it. Instead of anti-curating, the anti is spelled AUNTIE, as in auntie and uncle curating. So maybe that's another take on anti-curating.
It'll be a good double show, won't it?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you all for coming and listening. And we hope you'll come and see what's happening on the Blip 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 website, and come to Moscow and see Blip 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 in its physical manifestation when it arrives in Winzavod Centre for Contemporary Art.
Thank you very much.
Cool, thank you.